volume 4 in Revelations and Translations in the Joseph Smith papers. This, I think part of it, part of the reason for the crowd size, as we say, is that it's the Book of Abraham. Because I sure didn't see all of you here for all the other volumes that we've talked about here. But there is an enormous amount of interest in the Book of Abraham, in our history and in our theology, and you're going to be treated tonight with some words by two people who know their stuff. And I'll tell you just a little bit about their credentials, but not much, because I don't want to take too much more time. But you won't find anybody that's more amenable to helping others understand what this is about, putting it in a form that people can appreciate and understand. So we're excited to have Robin Jensen and Brian Hauglid with us tonight. Just real quick before I get into their intro, since some of you don't know our routine. So each of our editors tonight will probably take about 20 minutes to talk about the book and about, well, whatever they've chosen. And then we'd like to have a question and answer session, as we always do. And then at that point, if you wouldn't mind, just fold up your chair and put it out of the way so we can clear the aisles. And then if you'd come to the front and make your purchases, and then our editors will be happy to. They have signed all the books we had, but if you want it personalized, or if you want to chat for a minute, they'll be up here to do that as well. And then we have refreshments out in the hallway that we would like for you to enjoy afterwards. And this, as well as all the signings that we've had, will be on our website for you to watch later on if you want to, or if you know people who couldn't come tonight, to watch it at benchmarkbooks.com. And we've got dozens and dozens of past author events, some of which, I mean, if I told you all the authors, you'd know who many of them are. But we've had some great events here, and this is kind of our pride and joy. We're very selective about who we ask to do these, because there's thousands of books that come out every year, even in the LDS market, but very few to invite here because we kind of specialize in Mormon studies, and we don't have every book that comes out in the LDS market. In fact, very few of them. But books like this is our bread and butter. So.
The church formerly known as the Mormon.
Okay, we've got a couple of books coming out soon. There's a Martin Harris biography by Susan Easton Black and Larry Porter of BYU. That'll be soon. There's also a biography of Lot Smith, if you're familiar with the Utah War and much of Utah history. Lot Smith was quite prominent, so that's coming. Unfortunately, I can't announce any other formal signings like tonight. We're still working on some ideas, but as we get into the holidays, we don't do as much of that, so we'll be constantly lining up more authors for future events. So we invite you to stay tuned and make sure you're on our list. That's most of that kind of stuff. Robin Scott Jensen is Associate Managing Historian and Project Archivist for the Joseph Smith Papers. And he co-edited the first 2 volumes in the Revelations and Translations series, and has been involved with each of those volumes. He holds 2 master's degrees and is currently working on a PhD in history at the University of Utah. Brian Hauglid is Associate Professor of Ancient Scripture. He completed his PhD at the University of Utah in Arabic and Islamic Studies, and served as the director of the Laura, is it Willis? Center at the Neil Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, and editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. He he's done a number of, worked on a number of books and projects. They all have articles, other things. They're very prolific, and as much as I admire them for their credentials and what they produced, they're also wonderful human beings, and I consider each of these men my friend, and it's my pleasure to introduce them now. So you're going for it. Okay. Brian Batts lead off. So you need to put that in the pocket or in the Let's test that and see how it goes. Get that on there. We don't want to have any wardrobe malfunctions. So. See how test it and see if it.
Can you all hear me back there? Okay, good. So, I know that you're not here just for me or Robin. You're here for the Book of Abraham. That's what's drawing you here, just as Kurt said. And so I've had to kind of think about, okay, what would you want to hear? And that's a hard question to answer, since you might all have different things that you're sort of interested in when it comes to the Book of Abraham. So I'm just going to kind of lay out maybe just a few things here about the Book of Abraham in terms of some of the stickier issues, okay, which made this book coming out a little bit more work, I guess, to try and think how we're going to present things here. And since we've done this book here, as you know, the JSP books are shy away from interpretive type things. Okay, so in other words, this book isn't going to answer questions directly about the Book of Abraham. You're going to have to actually kind of get in there yourself and kind of see some things that might help you understand where to go with some of these issues. But it doesn't just come out right out and say, here's what we think about this issue. Here's what we think about that issue. Okay? And so, and many of you might already know that, because that's just the way the JSP project works. We just kind of lay it out there, just the facts, ma'am, kind of a thing, as best as we can. But tonight I'm going to give you just maybe a little bit of background on maybe some of the issues that you might be familiar with already that we're working with. And in terms of our having lots of conversations while we were doing the book, okay, that you didn't get, that you're not privy to, of course, in the book. But maybe I'll share a little bit about what kind of conversations we might have had. So the first big question in Book of Abraham studies is, what is the source of the Book of Abraham? And as you know, we have a number of documents. We have papyri fragments, which you're probably aware of, and we also have papers. Some of them are notebooks that have drawings in them from Oliver Cowdery, and maybe some drawings of some of the hieroglyphs from some of the papyri that they had. We have alphabet documents, 3 of them that come out of 1835, where it looks kind of like a lexicon, you know, where they put the character on the left margin, and then they kind of give you the meaning that they think is the meaning. And then they have a grammar book that kind of comes after that, where it expands all of the alphabet stuff into a 5-degree system. Okay, a 5-degree system, and the higher you get in the system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the more meaning or the more material that it's going to be covering. Okay, in other words, the 5th degree is probably the one that's going to have the most information there for you. The 1st degree might just have a word or maybe a little phrase or something like that. Okay, and then it just gets added upon as you go through those degrees. Okay, and then there's Abraham papers as well. 3 of them date to 1835, and these papers were scribed by W. Phelps, who was very involved in the Egyptian papers as well, and Oliver Cowdery was a part of the Egyptian project. You have Frederick G. Williams. He did an Abraham manuscript. And then you have Warren Parrish, another person who did Abraham manuscripts. But the interesting thing about these three manuscripts is that on the left margin again, you get certain characters, okay, and then you get the English text of the Book of Abraham, okay? And those papers have caused a lot of discussion and debate, okay? Some of them very heated debates about what that all means, okay? And some of you might be aware of some of those conversations or yelling sessions or whatever they might be, because some of them are very much that way. People get very ensconced in what they believe about these things. And we just put them in there, and there you have it. They're for you to look at, okay? And the other thing about these manuscripts is, especially the Abraham manuscripts, is they're taking the characters out of one of the fragments of papyri that was once attached to the fragment that has facsimile number 1 on it. Okay? You following me? So it's coming right off those top 3 lines, okay, on all 3 manuscripts. And the 3 manuscripts pretty much lay them out the same way, okay, with the same English text by them. And Robin will talk a little bit more about this, how that might have happened, how they might have come about. And so the question then is, what were they doing with this material? What was all that about? Did they know Egyptian? No, because Egyptian really wasn't known at that time, was it? I mean, Champollion had a book out, but it was in French, and it was overseas. And it wouldn't get translated into English until much later, even after Joseph Smith has passed away. So you don't really have that. And so what I see happening there is you have a very serious effort on their part, on Joseph Smith's part, on W. Phelps, Warren Parrish, and Oliver Cowdery, to try and understand Egyptian and Hebrew, okay, even before the Hebrew school, to try and understand those 2 languages, because they felt that that would be their gateway to the pure language of Adam, okay? They kind of felt like that was the doorway to that. And that was not something that they just came up with on their own. That was something that was kind of, in the air at the time. So it wasn't really anything new that way. And I also think that they looked at these papers very seriously, as far as maybe even inspired, that they looked at these papers as their efforts to bring about God's will and to create these documents under inspiration. Now, what do they have to do with what do the Egyptian papers have to do with the Book of Abraham? I think a lot. We find a lot of the Book of Abraham. We find the characters in the Book of Abraham, or that accompany these Abraham manuscripts, coming right out of the papyri. And a lot of the Egyptian materials are coming right out of some of the papyri. Not all the same papyri, of course, but you have certain connections between the Abraham papers and the Egyptian papers. For instance, in Abraham 1, where you have the discussion about who discovered Egypt. It was discovered by a woman underwater. Remember those verses in there? Well, that's in the Egyptian papers. But the thing is, it's in a very rough format. It's not just, it might have a phrase here, something like that fits with the Book of Abraham, but it's not the whole verse, okay? But you can kind of see how they got the verse put together. So it's kind of conceptual in there. Does that make sense to you? And so there is a relationship there going on. I want to say that I am grateful and indebted to the Egyptologists who have gone through these papyri. They've identified who they belong to. They've identified the date, about 150 BC. They've identified provenance, meaning that they know who these papyri belong to. So they provided a lot of information for us, okay, to understand about the papyri. But there's a limit to what the Egyptologists have helped us with here, okay? They haven't helped us as much on the papers, okay? Because that's not really their bailiwick. I mean, they're into the Egyptology stuff, and that's what they get into, and that's what they do. Okay? And we're grateful for that. But Robin and I have really plumbed the depths of these documents together for many hours to come up with what we have now in the book. And so I want to also say that what we're seeing with the papers is much beyond what the Egyptologists have given us when they're talking about the papers. Many years ago, Hugh Nibley said that the papers, they called them the Kirtland Egyptian papers back in those days, okay? Which is kind of not exactly correct because you have Nauvoo documents in there too. So it's not just Kirtland era papers that we're talking about. But that's what Hugh Nibley liked to call them. But Hugh Nibley proposed that these papers were put together by just the scribes, that Joseph Smith himself didn't really have that much to do with them, okay? Didn't really have that much to do with them. And so he kind of distanced these papers from Joseph Smith. And our Egyptologists have kind of followed along with Nibley up to the present day about that, okay? But we're finding other things here about these documents that don't quite say that. And you might be surprised to know that Hugh Nibley actually believed that the papyri that Joseph Smith is said to have translated from onto the Book of Abraham manuscripts, that he believed that those manuscripts represented the translation of the Book of Abraham. Okay, he looked at them and saw the characters on the left margin and all the English on the right side there. He said, yep, these are. And so his first theory was, well, these are called super cryptograms. Now what does that mean? That's a big word. That means that each character had lots and lots of information inside it, even though it was just one character. Okay? He also believed later on that these characters were that they were prompters. In other words, you get the character, it would prompt Joseph Smith to write these characters out. Okay, not that they in themselves had all that meaning in them, but it just prompted, kind of like a memory thing. Okay, but about in the early 1970s, and just when he's getting out his book, The Egyptian Endowment, are you all aware of the Egyptian Endowment book by Hugh Nibley? It came out in 1975. Then he takes a complete turn, opposite turn. It says, the Book of Abraham is not, okay, on the papyri we have, therefore it's not on these manuscripts, therefore, you know, this has nothing to do with Joseph Smith, or the manuscripts have nothing to do with Joseph Smith. And that's what kind of got the ball rolling. But at the beginning, he was very open to these documents being the translation papers. Well, Robin and I are kind of, you know, with the book here, you can. It's very open. It's a open kind of approach here, where you just kind of look at it and you kind of determine for yourselves whether what I'm telling you is it's right or not. I'm just giving you what I think. Okay, and this is not the word of the church. This is not the word of anybody authoritative here. This is coming from my research. And so when we have the Book of Abraham, and there's lots of questions. I mean, I have actually a ton of questions on here that I could throw at you, but I don't think I'm going to do that because I don't want to, you know, sow a bunch of confusion in here. The main point is that even though Joseph Smith and the brethren back in those days didn't know Egyptian, they were all very much interested in studying Egyptian, even though they didn't know the language. They didn't actually have a language teacher until Rabbi Seixas, okay, for the Hebrew school in early 1836. That's when they really had a teacher. Before that, it was, you know, and I think these documents are already done by the time that Hebrew school starts. In fact, that seems about the point where they stop. Once they start taking real classes in real language, and you know what it's like to take real classes in real languages, right? You got to learn all the verb tenses, and you got to learn nouns and subjects and adjectives in a different language completely. And so they actually don't go back to this project after that. But they still look at the project as important, even up into the Nauvoo period. Okay, so they're not, because they're thinking that, I think there's some inspiration involved with some of this, and so they're not totally wiping it out, but I think they are learning that it's a lot different to actually really learn a language by a real language teacher. Okay, those of you that have been in language classes know what I'm talking about, and so it's not easy. So when we talk about the Book of Abraham, I want to have the book, not this book, but just the book of understanding and curiosity wide open, and not just coming down with firm conclusions. You see what I'm saying? Keep your minds open about this. Okay? Keep your minds open. Do your own study. Try to understand the best you can with what we've done here to come up with your own thinking about this. Because these documents, this is the first scholarly edition of these documents ever. Okay? And now they're at your fingertips, all these documents. And some people are saying they were hidden, and some people, all kinds of things. Okay? But now they're available to every person who wants to look into this. Whether you're a member or not, doesn't matter. And you get to kind of think about it yourself and come up with what you think. And I will certainly be happy to provide my thoughts on it, since I've kind of maybe looked at it, maybe just a little bit more than you have perhaps. But I hope that if those of you that will pick up the book will try to understand and go through and see what these documents actually are. And you don't have to become an expert or anything. Just look at the documents. What do we have that's related to the Book of Abraham? And I can tell you that we have more related to the Book of Abraham than we do to any other book of Scripture. Even the JST. Okay, we have manuscripts for that, but these are different kinds of things here that you're getting with the Book of Abraham. And it's very interesting stuff. Okay, when you're trying to think about, well, what does this tell us about Joseph Smith as a translator? Okay, what does this tell us about how Scripture comes together? Okay, maybe it's more related to study it out in your mind and then ask me if it's right. Maybe it's more about that than we even realize. Okay, when we look at these documents, because these are some of the things I've thought about as I've perused these documents and tried to understand the relationship between each of the documents. And so, I don't know how much time I have left here, but let me just check. I actually gave myself, I've got two minutes left. So, I would say that to be looking forward to more information on these documents that's going to come out in the future as well. Okay? Because there are going to be interpretive things that are going to come out from this, and that might help some of you kind of, navigate things a little bit. The documents are absolutely fascinating, but they're not as straightforward as I think you'd like them to be in some ways. And so read what you can and try to understand. But in my own mind, I have tried as a researcher to keep an open mind about what this tells us about Joseph Smith. We may have to actually do some paradigm shifting because of this book when it comes to translation. I think that might happen. And I'm not going to predict it for sure, but I think it's a possibility that there could be some paradigm shifting when we're talking about the translation that Joseph Smith as a translator, maybe I should put it that way. Joseph Smith as a translator.
What do you mean by paradigm shift?
By paradigm shift, I mean sometimes we think that when translation, and maybe not all of you are thinking this, okay, I'm just saying, generally speaking, maybe just the lay member of the church, doesn't really doesn't really look into translation enough to know that there might be some nuancing and some different things that are going on there. For instance, when I first joined the church, I kind of just thought that the Book of Mormon just kind of fell into Joseph Smith's lap. He was just this passive receiver, kind of like a fax machine, okay? And that the information came to him, and he just had, and through him, it just got all written down, and there we have the Book of Mormon. And I'm not sure that that's simple of an explanation. And that's where I was coming from as a new member of the church. And I was in my 20s, so my frontal lobes were kind of developed at that time. So but that's kind of the way I thought about it. And maybe your thinking is developed beyond that, but I think the Book of Abraham will challenge all of us to think about it even further on what translation means in terms of Joseph Smith, in terms of him actually putting his own efforts into bringing forth the Book of Abraham with God's inspiration, with God's sanction, perhaps, maybe is the best word there. Does that make sense? That is me. We go to Robin now, so.
Good evening. Oh boy, we're packed to the rafters.
You want to try it over here?
Yeah, I'll let's see if I can get this with my sweaty fingers. All right. First of all, I'm gonna get it. You're gonna have to help me. If I can help my kids get dressed, you can help me get my mic on. So, can everyone hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you for coming. I really do appreciate the interest. Sometimes when you write a book, you wonder, are people going to actually read this? And it's particularly true of reference volumes. These are not designed to read cover to cover. In fact, I jokingly tell people that if they suffer from insomnia, these are pretty good books to cure that. Though with some of these volumes, don't read that above your head in bed, it'll fall down. And not that I have any experience on that,
I'm
but
going to have them disregard that.
yes. Kurt's just going to scratch off all sorts of
censoring here.
Second of all, I was going to thank Benchmark Books, but now I'm not so sure if I'm going to do that. But no, appreciate Kurt and Chris and Brian. So I think it's fairly safe to say that we're all gathered here together because we're interested in what the Book of Abraham tells us about Joseph Smith as Revelator. I am here to tell you that as a trained historian, you cannot prove or disprove divine truths. Miracles do not leave a textual record. There are religious studies, individuals that focus on the influence of religion in people's lives, but I cannot take the historical training that I received and prove or disprove Joseph Smith's truth claims. So I'll just put that right out. But at the same time, that does not give us an excuse to not pay attention to history. Sometimes we say history, we can't say this or that about truth claims or whatnot, but we shouldn't be sweeping some of this stuff under the rug, because Joseph Smith did teach his followers. He did leave some understanding of what's going on. He was able to provide some of this information to individuals. So as historians, we can track some of that, and we should. We should be facing this head on. So, and I'm going to ramble if I don't get my notes, so just a minute.
That's what I just did.
All right. Joseph Smith Papers, very briefly, for those that are not familiar, it is a scholarly project. They are reference books. We offer transcriptions of, and in some cases, images of historical documents. These are for other scholars to use. We write to scholars. We are mindful of a lay Latter-day Saint audience, but our primary audience are for scholars. The Joseph Smith Papers is divided into 6 different series. The history series, journal series, administrative series, legal and business series, the document series, and the revelations and translation series. This latest volume, the Book of Abraham and Related Manuscripts, publishes, and Brian talked about it a little bit, publishes in one volume all of the documents relating to the Book of Abraham manuscript and their attempts to understand the Egyptian language. This is an important milestone, the first time that these have all been available in print. And of course I'm biased, but I'm kind of proud of it. It's a nice volume. So, 1835, a man by the name of Michael Chandler came into Kirtland, Ohio with ancient artifacts from the Middle East. The very first question we should be asking is, what on earth are ancient artifacts doing in Kirtland, Ohio in 1835? That's essentially frontier America. Why have they made that journey? Well, this, to be very brief, this goes back to Western culture's interest in ancient Egypt. There's always been this fascination. Herodotus, an ancient Greek writer, looked across the Mediterranean Sea and was kind of interested in Egyptian culture or whatnot. Throughout the Middle Ages, there have been interest in this civilization. What on earth could have created the pyramids or wrapped the mummies or papyri, all this stuff. Napoleon took a number of scholars with him when he invaded Egypt. They, of course, discovered the Rosetta Stone, but there was this re-ignition of this Egyptian interest in Western culture. And as I joked about earlier, when you go into history, you're really only interested in the money. So when that's a joke, it's okay to laugh at that. When the scholars started being interested in the ancient Egypt, they were writing, but they also realized, you know what, we can sell some of this stuff. And so for those that have been to Europe, been to museums in Europe, the question of why are there Egyptian artifacts in the British Museum, for instance, there's a long history of that, of course. But the reason, very basically, is that people wanted to buy it. They were interested in this. When the European market got a little bit flooded, they just started sending documents or ancient artifacts over to America, and there was a ready audience over there as well. For those that couldn't buy it, they were fairly expensive. You had people that just toured with mummies. You could pay a nickel or a dime or a quarter and look at these ancient artifacts. It was fascinating. So Michael Chandler comes to Kirtland. He's on the very tail end of this touring of mummies, and he wants to get rid of his wares. So Joseph Smith and others pooled together money and purchased the papyri and the mummies. They only wanted the papyri, but Chandler said it's all or nothing, so they bought the mummies. So
what did they do with them?
we'll get to that. I'm going to very briefly get through the whole story if I can. We need to recognize that Joseph Smith had some familiarities and unfamiliarities when he saw the papyri. The familiarities we already talked about, he was very aware. He was part of his culture. He understood that, or as part of the culture, he was interested in these ancient artifacts. But because he was also a part of his culture in 1835, he was unfamiliar with the hieroglyphs. He could not read them, just like virtually everyone else of his contemporaries. Champollion, of course, in France was doing his thing around the same time, but Joseph Smith was not reading cutting-edge scholarship in French. I'm fairly confident in saying that. So Joseph Smith was inheriting his cultural assumptions about the hieroglyphs themselves. And what was that cultural assumption? Well, essentially it was the hieroglyphs were shrouded in mystery. They had deep meaning. If you wanted to learn the truth about human nature, the Egyptians had figured it out, or figured out much of it. When you see one character, it could mean multiple things. In fact, it could have whole sentences. Scholars in the Middle Ages, and they were scholars, had claimed to translate the hieroglyphs. They had claimed to decipher them. You have, for instance, a 3-volume dictionary of the hieroglyphs published generations before Champollion. When you look at it, Egyptologists say, yeah, he wasn't actually deciphering it. What it is he's essentially saying, here's my philosophy about life as seen through the hieroglyphs. He wasn't actually translating it, but what we understand is that you can learn a lot about a culture, about an individual who claims to receive or claims to have decipher the hieroglyphs, because he's inserting a lot of his assumptions, a lot of his truths, so to speak. So when Joseph Smith and others received these papyri, they began to studying them. This was another familiarity of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was a translator. He had translated earlier things. The church, of course, was founded shortly after the Book of Mormon was published. And if we remember the translation efforts of Joseph Smith, he himself instructed or taught, or through that experience, members were led to believe that there was both an intellectual component and a divine miraculous component of translation. Many of you are familiar with the story of Oliver Cowdery during the Book of Mormon translation. He wants to translate, he's excited, Joseph Smith dictates a revelation saying, sure, go ahead. Oliver Cowdery tries his hand at translating, he fails miserably. Joseph Smith dictates another revelation in which Oliver Cowdery is told, look, you thought this was an easy task, you thought that you'd just get it, that's not how it works. You got to study it out in your mind. Joseph Smith, the very first thing he did when he wanted to translate the plates, what did he do? He made copies of characters and tried to engage with scholars, up-to-date scholars. He sent with Martin Harris copies of the characters to get them translated. Joseph Smith was willing to interact with scholarship in his translation. During the Joseph Smith translation project, Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible, there's pretty clear evidence that Joseph Smith is relying on biblical commentary in his translation. So we know from Joseph Smith's own past that he relies on scholarship, on intellectual thinking. But then at the same time, there's a very clear divine, miraculous. Joseph Smith is, when he's pressed to talk about the Book of Mormon translation, he says, I'm not going to tell you how I did it. That's not for the world to know. What we do have from Joseph Smith is, I translated by the gift and power of God. The followers of Joseph Smith believed that it was a miraculous thing. When you have individuals saying, yeah, Joseph Smith looked into a rock and through divine means he was able to see the translation. That's miraculous. We're already in miraculous territory, right? So there's this dual translation, intellectual and revelatory, that Joseph Smith is presenting to his followers. So when he gets these papyri, when he gets the mummies and other artifacts, it's very natural actually for him to engage intellectually, to try to understand these hieroglyphs, to make sense of them. But of course, he's not engaging with them on a 21st century level. As historians, we can't read back our own knowledge onto that. So he is treating this like some of the other scholars that he may or may not have been familiar with. He's essentially trying to make sense of it. He's coming up with alphabet documents, with grammars, he's trying to come up with an Egyptian language system that really tells us more about Joseph Smith's cultural assumptions than it does about Egyptian language. You're going to be hard-pressed to find an Egyptologist that are going to look at these Egyptian manuscripts, Egyptian language manuscripts, and say, yeah, that's actual Egyptology, that's translation. Joseph Smith, when he's doing this work, is revealing more about his own cultural assumptions. All right. All right. So we've said this before. Joseph Smith was not translating. He was not doing Egyptology. When he was finished with the Book of Abraham, he did not know the Egyptian language. However, historical evidence does seem to indicate that he believed that he was translating from the papyri, or that he told individuals that he was in fact translating from the papyri. Now, this is there are some implications here for church members, for non-church members. Members of the church sometimes have assumptions about Joseph Smith's translations. We have our own familiarities and unfamiliarities, right? Members of the church say, well, if Joseph Smith wasn't actually translating, what does that mean about Joseph Smith's ability or his prophetic calling as a translator? That's probably a discussion not in a more scholarly setting, though. If you want to get into that, we can. But what it does help us understand is that Joseph Smith was a product of his time. It was a product of the 19th century. when he engaged in translation, when he engaged on kind of this intellectual process, when he studied things out in his mind, he brought to that process his cultural assumptions. And we should try to reconstruct Joseph Smith's milieu, his worldview, the things that he was engaged with. So the Book of Abraham, relatively speaking, gives us more documentary record of Joseph Smith's translation process than any other project. Brian talked a little bit about this. Book of Mormon, we have manuscripts, we have the printed text. We don't have much of his other studying it out in his mind, his engaging with the text. The JST, we have the text itself, that's it. Book of Abraham, however, we do have the Book of Abraham text itself, and then we have these Egyptian language documents that I was talking about. So what we have is this textual component of their studying it out in your mind. And as I said at the very beginning, because I'm a historian, I can't prove one way or the other Joseph Smith's truth claims. But we need to engage with the historical record. We cannot sweep it under the rug. For those that are members of the church, the Book of Abraham often leads the list of reasons why they may have left the church. I've seen that online and elsewhere. The Book of Abraham is troubling to some people. And so we cannot have false information impede members of the church understanding who Joseph Smith was as a translator. If we tackle Joseph Smith and what he told people, what he didn't tell people, what we can know from history, what we can't know from history, then you can have a foundation upon which to build faith or carefully assess Joseph Smith for what he said he was. That's probably about as apologetic as I'll get. So anyway, thank you again for coming. I really do appreciate it. We will now answer questions, unless we've answered all of the questions you have.
Is there any record that he used the Urim and Thummim at all?
So Wilford Woodruff is our best source. He was a printer in Nauvoo. He helped with the publication of the Book of Abraham. And he does in his I should repeat the question. The question is whether Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim in the translation of the Book of Abraham. So Wilford Woodruff, in his diary, said Joseph Smith is bringing forth these truths through the Urim and Thummim. That's probably the best that we have. There is evidence in Kirtland, not very good evidence, but there is some evidence that he's using a seer stone or Urim and Thummim in Kirtland. But we also have pretty explicit evidence that he stopped using a seer stone in his JST work, the Bible revision work. So if I had to guess, I would say, sure, it's possible either way. Joseph Smith had already shown that he could bring forth scripture both through a seer stone and not through a seer stone. So to me, it was miraculous for the members of the church either way. Yeah, anyway.
The 5 degrees of understanding or meaning, that's similar to Masonic, where there's words that mean something more if you're at a higher level. Who was it that practiced the 5 degrees? Who was it that developed it? Where was it used and how? And
So the question...
This was before Joseph got involved with Masonry.
Yeah, so the question was about the 5 degrees in some of the alphabet documents and how it's related to Masonry. In Masonry, 5 degrees, depending on what degree, it has different meanings and whatnot. Who's developing this? So the biggest problem, and I guess I should have started with this, the biggest problem is that we have very few self-reflective statements from those involved in the project. We don't, unfortunately, have a journal from anyone in the summer of 1835 where they say, hey, we just got papyri and this is what we're going to do and here's our motivation, and hey, for all you future historians, this is what we're doing. We just don't have any of that. So we have the documents themselves, really. The 5 degrees really crystallizes in the alphabet, the grammar and alphabet volume, and that is, in the alphabet documents, and that is in the handwriting of Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and Frederick G. Williams. So, but as far as who's instigating that, who's starting it, we just don't know.
But did they say that there's different degrees of understanding of each hieroglyph, for example?
That they didn't say that specifically, but it's pretty obvious that that's what they mean. When you go, especially in the, well, it's really seen in the grammar and alphabet volume. You can see one character represented in 5 different degrees throughout the book, and the definition of that character, depending on your degree, expands significantly. So it's just, it's pretty clear that that's what's going on. And Brian, I'm answering these questions. If you want to jump in, feel free.
Well, I'll come up there, but I don't know if anybody can hear me back there, so
Yeah.
might have to use your little mic thing.
Yes, clear in the back.
Go back here. You're hearing well, good.
Enlighten us to what degree the facsimiles, which have been controversial and people have said they really didn't relate to what Joseph Smith said they related to, does your study indicate that they do or don't, or how do you reconcile that?
So the question is about the facsimiles and how they relate to Joseph Smith's work, whether they do, whether they don't. So there's a subset of scholarship that has really tried to tackle the papyri and the vignettes, what are called facsimiles, and try to correlate that or not correlate that with Joseph Smith's, with the Book of Abraham. We have not done a lot of that because a lot of that work is not what the Joseph Smith Papers does. The Joseph Smith Papers, it presents the documents for other scholars to draw their own conclusions. So no, we haven't done that in our volume. The explanations in the facsimile really is the crux of it, right? Particularly facsimile 3, where I'm thinking of one of the explanations says, this is King Pharaoh. You'll know that because of the characters above his head. So we have Joseph Smith, presumably, who is making this translation, making this correlation that these characters means that this is Pharaoh. And that's not what it is. The Egyptologists recognize who that figure is. They can read the characters somewhat, for the most part. And that's not it. And so that really is the question of if Joseph Smith says that this is a translation, and it's not actually a translation, what does that mean? Well, this is again where if we look to kind of his cultural inheritance of what scholarship meant to understand the hieroglyphs, where you're kind of publishing your best guess, and if it sticks, if people agree on it, or if people build upon that, great. That's what you do. If I had to guess, I would guess that Joseph Smith, if he hadn't have died and lived for 20 years, he would have just incorporated Champollion's work into his Book of Abraham and just kind of rolled with it. And that's what he was. That's what he did. The alphabet documents, the grammar and alphabet volumes, they were not finished. Joseph Smith did not consider that finished. The Book of Abraham was not finished. This was a work in progress throughout Joseph Smith's lifetime. And I think that he just would have incorporated additional light and knowledge, so to speak. So, yes?
How much input or feedback, if any, did you get from John Gee, Carrie Wilson, the LDS Egyptologists?
So we got a number of,
Repeat it.
yes, sorry, I keep forgetting. The question is how much from John Gee, Carrie Mulestein, other Egyptologists, how much input did we get from them? When we had a good draft of the volume, we sent it out to a number of scholars, including both John and Carrie, but also others, both members of the church and not members of the church, who were Egyptologists and other experts in American history, religious history. This volume was pretty carefully scrutinized beforehand. There's still errors. We've found an error already. Of course, when you publish a volume, you're bound to find the error, and then you just want to kick yourself. But so it's not a perfect book. No one publishes a perfect book. But yes, we've had it pretty carefully scrutinized by scholars. And scholarship, you're not going to find academics who agree on everything all the time, and that's fine. Brian and I don't agree on everything, and that's
Almost, though.
and that's just what scholarship is. We're trying our best in this volume to present the documents as best as we can, so that scholars can use our work to build upon the works of further academia.
Can I follow up on that one?
Sure.
What is the, I missed part of your presentation because I'm running around here, but how does your approach differ from those, like you mentioned, the two and another that some would say are, I guess you'd say Mormon apologists. So tell how you differ perhaps and what the other idea might be as to the explanation.
Yeah, so the question is how we might differ our volume, our scholarship with others, with Mormon apologists. I would actually add that in some ways, I consider myself a Mormon apologist in the sense that I am a member of the church. I work for the church, and I believe that the best thing for the church is to get accurate historical information out there. And if I can do that, then individuals won't get shocked with some of the things that they find online. I learned this from Richard Bushman when he came to BYU as a student. He said one of the things he learned about writing Rough Stone Rolling, the biography of Joseph Smith, is that you don't beat around the bush. If there's a problem in history, you just tackle it head on. It's been his experience, and it's been mine, that if you do that, then you understand the historical nature of things. And sure, it's absolutely going to change what you thought before, but that's the excitement of scholarship. That's the excitement of learning history, right? I think that some of the past apologetics, some of the past research, well, I'm going to let Brian talk about that, unless you want me to talk about it, because I've been talking too much.
Didn't Richard actually say don't beat around the bush, man? I couldn't let that go.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I can give you two examples of where we might differ with the Egyptology apologists, okay, particularly. Egyptologists believe that all of the Book of Abraham was translated and more by the end of 1835. But we have good historical documentation that tells us that he did the rest of the Book of Abraham, meaning he did pretty much all of Abraham 3, 4, and 5 in February and March of 1842. I mean, that's what the documentary evidence says, and that's what's in the book. We ran that by the Joe Smith Papers people, and that's what it is. It's pretty clear. There's also an argument that the Book of Abraham was on papyri that we no longer have. It's called the missing papyri theory, and at least from my perspective anyway, I found evidence that argues against that they were working off the papyri that we actually have in the church today. Okay, that taking the manuscripts and taking those characters off the papyri and putting them on the manuscripts. And there's other reasons for that. I've got other historical sources that seem to suggest that that's what's happening. It's hard to prove that it's on the papyri that's missing because, well, it's missing. I mean, so how we can't really go anywhere with that. So we're just dealing with the sources that we have, and the sources are telling me anyway. I don't know about Robin, but telling me anyway that that's not necessarily the case. And so there's, those are two examples anyway. Does that help you, Kurt?
Yep.
Okay.
Back there.
What went into your decision not to give current English translations of the hieroglyphs on the papyri? You just have the characters themselves, no translations. Please discuss that.
Well, I'll take a stab at it here. We've already...
Repeat it.
Oh, yeah. What went into thinking that we would not put translations of the papyri in our book? Is that about right? Okay, what went into that? And I'm not exactly sure, what... I mean, I was in a lot of conversations, but I can't remember talking about this particular point. But we do have Michael Rhodes, who's already translated them. I think pretty much all of what we have, I think Michael Rhodes has already translated. So we didn't feel like we needed to do that, right?
Yeah, so the Joseph Smith Papers, we want to present the documents to better inform Joseph Smith's life, his understanding of the world, what is going across his desk, things like that. And an English translation of the papyri would not have gotten us there because he was not able to read the papyri. And so we presented the papyri as best as we can from how Joseph Smith himself would have seen it, and that is not an English translation. And yeah, as Brian said, Michael Rhodes and Robert Rittner have translated the papyri, and we cite to them, we give in our introduction of the papyri, here's what they are, here's what they were used for anciently, but since Joseph Smith didn't have any of that background, we treated that fairly lightly.
Yeah, I think, Brian, you said that the Egyptologists had determined the provenance of the papyri and dated them around the 2nd or 1st century BC.
That's correct, yeah.
If that's correct, and what is the connection then with Abraham, who, if he was a historical figure, lived many centuries before that time?
Well, I can tell you how they answer that.
Okay.
They answer that by saying it's a copy of a copy of a copy. You know, that you had an original, then you have a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, all the way down to the 150 BC or whatever it ends up as. But as Robin said earlier, how did Joseph Smith view these documents, these papyri documents? How did he view them? And I think you said already that he viewed them as having the Book of Abraham on them, written by the hand of Abraham upon papyrus. So that he believed that these were not copies, but they were actual documents that Abraham himself wrote on. Okay? And so you kind of have to grapple with that one, I guess, a little bit, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get back to where Joseph Smith is coming from with these documents the best as we can.
So just to follow up there, trying to say this as neutrally as possible. So members of the church are often taught to receive personal revelation, right? This is taught throughout the church. They're also taught that personal revelation is a lifelong experience. Some members of the church could recognize some of Joseph Smith's own translation in their experience of personal revelation. So in other words, members of the church could say, hey, I've received a revelation and it's XYZ. Years later, they could recognize, you know what, actually, in thinking about it, living my life experiences months, years later, the revelation wasn't actually XYZ, it was really just Y. And I made the assumptions about X and Z. Members of the church could say, you know what, maybe Joseph Smith received revelation for the Book of Abraham, and through that revelation, he made certain assumptions that were not actually true. And I think that members of the church could find that reasonable, that does match their own experience with personal revelation.
I'm curious, as historians, what do you make of the recent attempts by some would say redefine the term translation, and what your comfort level as historians is using that term? It sounded, if I heard you correctly, that you said it was not a translation, so it sounds like you're not comfortable using that term as defined as some revelatory process.
So, yeah, the question is about the term translation and how it's been redefined recently. So for the Joseph Smith papers, we use translation actually quite a bit, but we also have a statement at the beginning of the volume saying, we use the word translation, but it doesn't mean what most people today see as translation. And we're comfortable saying that because that's not how Joseph Smith used it, or not always, anyway. Translation, you've got one individual that has knowledge of two languages, and they transfer a text from one language to another language. That's how we view translation. That's what translation is. For the most part, that's not how Joseph Smith used that term. And so, as a historian, personally, I feel very comfortable using translation as long as I'm clear in explaining what that meant for Joseph Smith, what it meant for his followers. Joseph Smith taught the church that he was translating the Book of Mormon, that he was translating the Bible, that he was translating the Book of Abraham. But it's not the translation that we recognize. And so right off the bat, do you try to come up with a term that kind of captures what Joseph Smith is doing, or do you use the term that Joseph Smith is using and kind of explain what that means? And we've opted for this latter, where yeah, let's use the word translation, but let's complicate it. So I guess in answer to your question, we're also kind of redefining that term translation, but I would actually say that history is redefined every single generation as new generations have questions, as sources surface, as new methodologies are incorporated by scholars. History is always redefined, so to speak. Right behind you.
You indicated that these Egyptian documents are making their tour, and presumably Joseph could have come across other documents. What attracted him to these as opposed to some others?
So there's actually, the question is, Joseph Smith may have confronted other touring groups, other groups of papyri. What attracted him to these? There actually was, there's good evidence, late 1820s, that there was a touring group that came within, I think, 30, 40 miles of Palmyra, where the Smiths were living. So he was very much familiar with kind of this concept of touring groups. He may have even seen some of that. We have a statement that, and it's problematic because Michael Chandler goes on record saying that he came to Kirtland because he knew that Joseph Smith could translate the papyri. Well, I don't know how much Joseph Smith's, I find that hard to believe, that word of Joseph Smith as a translator circulated enough in America that a non-member of the church would come to Kirtland to, I think Chandler recognized that maybe he could sell something to the Mormons. I mean, people were capitalizing on the Mormons all the time back then. It's not unusual at all for Joseph Smith himself to, so the Book of Mormon is an ancient narrative. It presents itself as an ancient narrative. Joseph Smith teaches the church believes that God can inspire individuals through ancient narratives. So it's not too crazy for papyri to come into town, Joseph Smith and others to say, oh, here we go. Oliver Cowdery, Warren Parrish, they were promised in Revelation that they would translate additional records. Here are those additional records.
Wasn't there a statement about the time when they obtained the mummies and the papyrus describing these writings as writings of Abraham and Joseph? Has there been anybody found any indication that there was separate writings from Joseph that may have been different material that they looked at, or is that the only thing we have is just that statement?
So the question is, there's a statement about both Abraham and Joseph, biblical figures being on the present, right? Their writings being present on the papyri, and whether we have indication that Joseph, the writings of Joseph, or more of the writings of Abraham were ever put to paper. No, we don't have good evidence for that. There are, in fact, I would argue that we have evidence to the contrary. So. It doesn't seem that Joseph Smith is producing any of the writings of Joseph, the biblical figure. Joseph Smith was editor of the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo. He was publishing the Book of Abraham. He published it in 3 series, or in 3 issues. They promised more Book of Abraham. They said, hey, once we get more, we'll publish it. If I had to guess, I would say that it wouldn't have taken much for them to publish another installment. And if they had some, I think they would have published it. So if I had to guess, I would say that Joseph Smith did not produce additional Abraham material.
It's hard to say whether there was actual separate writing by that other author.
Yeah. There is a source that a lot of people use where they read, the way it's interpreted, they read the Book of Abraham for several hours in Far West. It's a reminiscence. It's fairly problematic, and if you read the entire source, it's pretty clear that they have not just the Book of Abraham, but also the Bible revision. So it's quite possible that they're reading multiple texts, including the Bible revision, and he's mistaken in assuming that all of this is the Book of Abraham.
Quick question. Brian, you mentioned other sources that talk about the 1842 work on it. As I poke through like volumes 1 and 2 of the journals, anytime something comes up about the Book of Abraham or Egyptian, like I'm making notes on it because I found it really cool that it's even mentioned, because it seems like it's so hard to find historical records of the translation or information about it. And usually even in those Joseph Smith entries, it's like one sentence of spent the day in translation of the Egyptian record, and then I went to a wedding or something, and you're like, what about that record? Like, I was curious, do you, outside of Joseph Smith's journals, are there other sources or other scribes that wrote about it or made reference to it?
So the question is, do we have any other sources that talk about the translation of the Book of Abraham outside of the year 1835 accounts? Is that right?
And outside of Joseph Smith's journals.
And outside of Joseph
he makes
Smith's
short
journals.
mention of it.
Yeah, okay. Polly P. Pratt mentions it. Who else?
Phelps to his wife.
Yeah, Phelps to his wife. This is August 1835,
Yeah.
talking about it.
Cowdery to Fry.
Oh yeah, Oliver Cowdery, a letter to William Fry in December of 1835, talks about it. There's
Woodruff Journal. There's
the Wilford Woodruff Journal has information that you can check out.
and we cite all of this in our volume.
And we cite it all in our volume, so
Awesome.
that's not bad, is it?
Great.
Not bad at all. And we also have in 1842, okay, March 8th and 9th, where there's talking about translation. Now that is in Joe Smith's journals, okay? Now, you can find that in the Joe Smith papers. Yeah, you got it. Okay, good. Where they're talking about translation.
And I'll just say one thing about that journal. In 1835, he begins his daily journal in September of 1835, and there are a lot of good references in the fall of 35. We need to remember that there's not a textual record for the summer of 1835 in Joseph Smith's own journal. So it's quite likely that he's working on this and whatnot, but the fact that it's not documented shouldn't convince historians that. In other words, often historians say, oh, there's reference in October and November that he's working on this, so therefore that's when it happened. Well,
Yeah,
it's very possible that it could have
whenever
been in
he
July,
just-
August, September, but that Joseph Smith wasn't actually
Yeah.
documenting that.
That's a
So.
great point.
Could you continue with a brief timeline of the mummies and the papyri to today?
Yeah, I did realize that I forgot to mention. So Joseph Smith has these mummies. He's showing them to a lot of followers. When he dies in June of 1844, Lucy Mack Smith, his mother, inherits them. She's showing them off. It seems like that's one of her main sources of income. She's charging 25 cents. I would have paid double that to see it. And then when Lucy Mack Smith dies, Emma Smith sells them within a matter of weeks. So she probably doesn't like dead bodies in her house. They go to a family, and it appears that the collection is broken up at least into two parts. One part goes down to St. Louis and then up to Chicago. And then in the 1870s, there's the Great Fire of Chicago, and it's we're pretty sure that collection of the mummies and the papyri burned up. And for the longest time, scholars just assumed all of it had burned up. But then in the 60s, the Metropolitan Museum of Art transferred the papyri to the LDS Church, and that's where we have the extant papyri. Once they were acquired by the church, they were published, and scholars have not calmed down ever since, I guess.
The first time I became aware of any controversy about the Book of Abraham was when I heard the name Aziz Atiya and the phrase "a book of breathings." I haven't heard that enter the conversation yet. Maybe it did, and I was speaking. But
Well, we in the book you'll find that the papyri, at least two pieces, or maybe three pieces, belong to the Book of Breathings of Hor. Okay, we've got that in there. And then there's another set of papyri that belong to Tashirat Men. We don't call it that in there. I'm not sure what we call it in the book. Is that the Semines or something like that?
Yeah,
I think that's supposed to be the Greek name or something, is that right?
yeah.
That wasn't my doing. I would have put Tashir Min because that's what all the other Egyptologists call it. So yes, that's right. We're still talking about that actually. And Aziz Atiya was a great scholar up at the University of Utah, and he kind of became, I guess, the liaison between the church and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we kind of owe him, I guess, helping all that happen. And it was who was it? N. Eldon Tanner and President.
Yeah.
It was 67. So who was the prophet then? Was that McKay?
McKay.
So David O. McKay and N. Eldon Tanner was involved, and I can't remember who else right now. But so, and then when they got it, when they were handed over, I think they just thought, what are we going to do with this? And just, where's Hugh Nibley? Yeah. Let's just give it to him. See if he can make sense of these things. So,
can we reliably put dates on when the part of the Book of Abraham that we have that's published was written, and then reliably put dates on when the Kirtland Egyptian papers, the alphabet, was started and then essentially finished in the sense that they weren't working on it?
Yes and no. Yeah, the question is about the dating of the manuscripts. How reliable can we be in knowing when the actual Book of Abraham manuscripts and the Kirtland Egyptian documents, the Egyptian language documents, were written down? Yes, there is a chunk of time where we know they had to have happened in this time. But if you look at our volume, we have a lot of circas in there where we don't have definitive dates. So we know that some of these documents had to have been created after the papyri came on the scene because they're copying papyri, or they're copying characters. So it's after July, or in July or after July. And then it's pretty clear that for the Kirtland project, that they're done by really kind of November, December, maybe January, but probably late 35, because that's when they start up with learning Hebrew, and they would have learned things from Hebrew about transliterating and whatnot that probably would have been incorporated in that, and it wasn't. So yeah, those are kind of the rough dates for Kirtland. We do have some journals entries where we know, yep, he's definitively working on something on October 1st, I believe, or something, where he mentions the alphabet document or things like that. For Nauvoo, it's a little bit more narrow, where the 1 March 1842 issue is where they published the first portion of the Book of Abraham, and then it's 15 March issue where they published the second installment. And so it's February or March that, I forget the exact journal entry, but Joseph Smith in his journal says, I commenced translating the Book of Abraham for the next issue, and that's the Book of Abraham 2 verse 19 through the end. And so we have a pretty clear day of when he started.
So I just wanted to point out and add, who gave that question? I can't remember who. Okay, good. So Jim right here, okay. So what we do find out here is that the Book of Abraham translation and the Egyptian papers are created simultaneously, okay? Because we're seeing that in the 1835 journals. And one entry will say, working on translating the Book of Abraham, another entry will say, we're translating the alphabet to the Book of Abraham, or something like that, or we're working on the Egyptian stuff, okay? And so it's going on concurrently, which, historically that's, I think, significant, okay? But still, it's in that same time period that Robin was talking about, somewhere between July and the end of November that we're talking about. So it's pretty close, I think, it's not too bad.
And then one other quick follow-up. Parley P. Pratt said that Joseph used the seer stone. Is that a reliable statement, along with Wilford Woodruff?
So the question is, Parley P. Pratt said that Joseph Smith used a seer stone. Is that a reliable source there? I don't know if I've ever looked at that particular source to find credibility.
It's not the best. Parley P. Pratt wasn't involved in he wasn't involved in the Kirtland, he wasn't involved in the Nauvoo. but he certainly knew people that were, so it's possible. And this is a later-ish source. It's possible that he's getting that from someone, but it's not. I wouldn't consider it an eyewitness.
There's a reference I heard one time that somebody was at a table and they had a scroll and the scroll fell off and kind of rolled across the room, and so that there evidently were lots of scrolls. Do you know about that reference?
Joseph F. Smith.
Yeah. So the question is. There's a source where it talks about the scrolls kind of unrolling, and it indicates that it's a pretty large source. That's pretty late. Joseph F. Smith is that?
Joseph F. Smith said he recalled when he was 6
Yeah.
years old. They were on the ground in the mansion
Well, it's
home.
actually Hugh Nibley hearing it from his uncle,
Good call.
Preston Nibley?
Preston Nibley.
Preston Nibley, who heard it from
Recalling.
Joseph F. Smith, who heard it from. So it's kind of in Islam we have what we call
authorities that have you ever heard of hadith? Hadith is just in Islam, it's just a report about Muhammad, and they like to have authorities at the beginning of those hadith. So and so heard it from so and so, heard it from so and so, heard it from so and so. That's what this is, okay? And it's late.
Yeah.
So, and Hugh Nibley never gave any sources for that. He just said, I heard it from my uncle, who heard it from so and so, who heard it from so and so. And so I think that's kind of a reliability issue.
For sure.
We do, though, have good evidence to say that by Kirtland, the papyri are placed on backing, paper backing, to kind of stabilize that they were falling apart. And then as early as Nauvoo, they are in frames, glass frames. And so they're pretty early worried about the condition of the papyri, trying to preserve them. And so, yeah, but it's possible that some portions are kind of falling apart, but you got a scroll that's still fairly good and well intact.
Best guesses on the length? I know that goes back and forth a lot.
Yeah, so the best guess is to the length of the scrolls.
I'd say Klaus Bear.
Yeah, so we rely essentially on what others have done with that, and that is a scholarly debate, but I certainly don't have the expertise to comment on that. In other words, I'm relying on 3 or 4 different scholars that have weighed into that. So,
what are their names? Just curious, or is that in the book?
John Gee talks about it. Chris Smith and Andrew Cook. Klaus Bear writes about it.
Yeah. So
Klaus Bear did it first, and his estimate was a lot closer to Andrew Cook's and Chris Smith's measurements. And John Gee was trying to argue that it was upwards of 40 feet, and he doesn't argue it anymore. And so there's a real discrepancy there between those measurements. And I look back at Klaus Bear and the readings I've done with him. He was a very fair person. And he and Nibley were close scholars. You know, they were friends, and so seeing that Andrew and Chris came up with a similar number as Klaus Bear,
Which was what?
Which was what was it, 51 to 61 centimeters or something like that. I can't. I'm just off the top of my head, but it was but not 40 feet.
Yeah.
Definitely not 40 feet. So is that?
That's a lot of papyrus.
So, is there another question out there?
Just one more. You had mentioned that it looks like the evidence is not for the lost amount of
Missing papyri?
that would, but you do agree that there has been some that has been lost.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the question is, I mentioned that I don't necessarily go along with the missing papyri theory, but that doesn't mean that there isn't missing papyri. There is missing papyri. Okay, but I think the pieces that we have were privileged back in Joseph Smith's day. Okay, they were put under glass, they were put on walls, and I have several historical sources that Joe Smith is pointing right to these glazed slides and saying, there's the signature of Abraham. Okay, or I've translated the book of Abraham from this papyri. And so it's pretty clear there. And the Egyptologists, they kind of argue that there's a long roll, but we really only have one source on that from a girl named Charlotte Haven, who visited Nauvoo in 1842, and Mother Smith just says, or she says, Mother Smith showed me a long roll. But it doesn't actually say that it has the Book of Abraham on it. So there's a long roll going on there, but I just don't know what that one was. So.
Okay, last one. Oh, last question, right?
Did they talked about there also being star charts in with the papyrus. Is there anything that's ever come of that other than just the mention that there were star charts?
Astronomy, system of astronomy that was unfolded. Oh. Yeah, so there's a reference in Joseph's journal where he's, the question was whether there are star charts in the papyri and whatnot. Joseph Smith in his journal did mention that, I'm not going to get the wording exactly right, but system of astronomy was unfolded to us, something along those lines. There are mentions of stars, other system of astrology that's mentioned in the Grammar and Alphabet volume, so that does match. There, of course, then is facsimile 2, which has some of that as well. But as far as the papyri itself is concerned, I'm not familiar with I'm not aware of any Egyptologists that are recognizing astronomy in the papyri that we have.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. Let's give him another hand.